ChatGPT functions are very interesting because they allow developers to directly interface with different models to create functions that they can call through system prompts. In this video, I'll do a crash course on exactly how to use them. This will be beginner friendly and it'll cover everything you need to know if you're starting out with GPT functions and how to create them, how to interface with them, and then how to customize them to whatever your needs are. Let's begin. As an example of what I'll cover, it'll be three main parts. The first will be how to connect up GPT functions, then create a few simple functions like Hello World, then a more complex example where I'll connect GPT-4 up to the web so it can scrape information, analyze it, and return it back to users. Before I jump into actually building a function, let me showcase the OpenAI documentation for function calling. Now, this documentation basically describes how the models for using function calling is only really available for ChatGPT version 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4. These two have been finely tuned to produce a special JSON object with the arguments to be able to call functions. This actually means that functions aren't called directly by OpenAI and its models. Instead, it passes the information across to be able to call those functions. As a little bit of information, before function calling was created, people were already trying to do something similar by fine-tuning models and have them produce strict outputs that you could plug into a function. Function calling just makes this much easier, and it's essentially 4 steps that OpenAI recommends. The first is to do a normal prompt. The second is to essentially get a response back from that prompt. The third is to call your function. And the fourth is to append that function to a new prompt. And if this is taken into a more descriptive example, let me give you this one here. Imagine you're trying to get the weather here in Australia. So you type into ChatGPT, what is the weather? The only difference now is that you've also defined a weather function as part of that very first prompt. So this is step 1. Step 2 will be the response back from OpenAI. So now that it knows it has a function to call the weather, it can decide whether it just wants to produce a normal output for the user, or if it wants to call this function and then append the results to a later request. And in this case, if you've described the function well, it'll try to call that function by giving you a JSON object requesting that function to be called, as well as the parameters of, say, Australia being passed in and stringified as part of that object. In step 3, you get that response back. You see that rather than a regular response from OpenAI, you're instead getting a function call. And the function call is a JSON object you're going to unstringify, you're going to parse it, and you're going to see that the attribute Australia is there. You can now plug that straight into your own function inside of your code to execute. You get a result back from your own code, and then you can append the results of that into the next call that you make from OpenAI. And this continues to loop depending on the type of conversation you're having with the model. Here is the example from OpenAI, and as you can see, it's very similar to the example I was talking about. This is inside of a development environment, and it was essentially step 1, 2, 3, and 4 we're going to take a look at. Now this is inside of Python, and here is our example function. Now this is just a dummy function. It's not a real function. It's not calling a real API. It's just kind of used as an example, and it's called getCurrentWeather. We pass in the location as well as the unit, and we get a response back. But let's actually have a look at what's happening for step 1, 2, and 3. So step 1 is to call the API from OpenAI and to pass in 2 things. We're going to pass in a message as well as the functions available. Now the message is just a conversation like you would normally have with ChatGPT. So we're passing in the role as user as well as the content. In this case, it's just saying, what's the weather like in Boston? But what we're also doing here is passing in these functions. Now you'll notice that the functions are actually an array because you can pass in more than one function. Inside of this array, we just have one object of a single function, and it is that getCurrentWeather function. We've got a description of it, which is to get the current weather given in a location, as well as the parameters. In this case, we have 2. We have the location as well as the unit. For the location, we've got a description, the city, state, or San Francisco. And for the unit, we do have 2 options here for Celsius or Fahrenheit. There is one more field here called required, and this basically means that if we're going to call this function, we definitely need the location. Now, as part of step 1, we actually have to call the API from OpenAI. So here you can see we're calling GPT 3.5 Turbo. We're passing in the messages as well as the functions, and we're setting function calling to auto, which means that OpenAI can kind of decide. Finally, we get a response back, and we save this in response_message. So that's all of step 1. Now let's take a look at step 2. Step 2 is really simple. We just check if the response is calling a function. So here we're checking if response underscore message.get has the option there function call. We move straight to step 3. So step 3 is basically calling that function. This step is a little bit tricky, so let me get through it. The main aspects is essentially getting the function name that we're calling. We're also parsing the JSON of the arguments. And the final thing is to pass in these 2 arguments over here to call the function. And this function response is just saved under function response. Now later, we need to append this when we go to step 4. And step 4 is calling the API once more. Now that we have the function response, we're going to essentially append the response message and append the function with its name and its response as well. So this allows us now to call GPT 3.5 Turbo once more with the message and get our final response, and this will be printed out as a message. This might all seem kind of complicated, but from a user point of view, they're not going to see any of this. They'll just see Chat GPT basically being prompted for the weather and then getting a response back. But what's actually happening in the background is these 4 steps. And the output is essentially what we would expect, which is the temperature or the weather that you essentially are looking for. Now, all of this still might seem a little bit complicated, and it'll make a lot more sense when we jump in and do an actual demo of an actual example. So let's do that right now. Quick pause. If you're looking to learn more about OpenAI, I've put together a small handbook which basically covers a lot of these things, including things like actually doing custom fine-tuning, as well as understanding how ChatGPT works under the hood with things like OpenAI and their APIs. And I've got a few starter templates, and I've linked to everything in the description below. If you guys want to check that out or just support the channel, then definitely have a look. I'll start here on the OpenAI website. The first thing you'll need is an account. I'm going to select from the menu to log in, and I already have an account, so I'll be taken to this screen over here. I'm going to select the API section here because we're going to develop an API that uses functions. This is the dashboard with documentation, API references, and examples, but I'll head to the top right here and select to view API keys. This is a secret key that you can generate, and you'll want to keep this private. In this case, I'm just going to label mine Chat GPT Functions for this project, so it's nice and clear. If you have your own key, make sure you don't share this on the internet, and if it does leak, make sure that you revoke or delete access to it. For this one here, I'll be deleting it after the end of this video. Next, inside of VSCode, I'm going to have a new folder and a new file. I'm going to call this file index.js, and here I'm going to put in the syntax for Chat GPT Functions. But first, I need to install the OpenAI library. So here in the console, I'm going to npm install OpenAI, and I also have NodeJS installed, which is what I'll be using for this demo. Alright, so let me import this library into our file. I'm going to pass in import, and the 2 items I'll import is the configuration as well as the OpenAI API. And this obviously I'll import from OpenAI. Next, I'll need to set the configuration. I'll create a new const value here called configuration, and I'll run a new configuration passing in an object with 2 values. The 2 values will be the organization, which is an ID that you get inside of your account, and the other being the API key, which we retrieved earlier. Let me actually jump into the OpenAI website right now to grab the organization as well so that you guys can see where it is. Here on the OpenAI website, I'm going to head over to my account and then to settings, and here the organization ID can be found. I'm going to copy this piece of text and then paste it here in the organization section, and I'm going to do the same for the API key. There's one last thing we need to do to initialize all this. To create a value called OpenAI, we're going to call OpenAI API, passing in the configuration, and once that's done, we can use this new value to create requests and receive them from OpenAI. Now it's time to create the very first function. I'm just going to create a hello world function. Here I'll pass in function hello world, and I'll also pass in an argument called append string, which I can use later. This will simply console log out hello world, but it'll also console log out the appended string that I want to pass. Next, I want to call OpenAI, so I'll create an async function to be able to do this. This async function shall be called call ChatGPT with functions. And I'll also pass in the append string, which I can define a little bit later. Here, I'm going to set the value for chat to equal the awaited response from OpenAI when I do a create chat completion. And this chat completion is going to pass in a few different values. First, I want to define the model which I'll be using. In this case, we'll be using Chat GPT 3.5 Turbo, and more specifically, the -0613 version. Now, we're also going to pass in the messages, and for these messages, I'm really just going to start off with an array of 2. The first will be the role for the system, so this kind of defines what you want ChatGPT to do, and in this case, I just wanted to perform function calls, and in this case, I've just got the one hello world function. The next message will be the message from the user themselves. So for this message, I'll do the role as a user, and I'll set this to essentially be to call the hello world function and pass in the following argument, that as a user, I'd like to call the hello world function, passing in the string, it's about time. Now the fun part, to create the functions themselves. I'm going to pass this in as an array with a single object. It'll just be the one function that we have here. So I'll pass in the name to be hello world, making sure that the caps is properly identified with the uppercase W. I'll have the description here that it prints a hello world with a string passed to it. The next is quite important. It is the parameters, which is an object. The first main value here is the type, which is object as well. And then the properties, which are the different types of arguments you want it to utilize and pass back as a stringified object. Now in this case, I just have the one, which is append string, and this is a string that you append to the hello world message. Finally, I'll pass in required, having an array of different properties that definitely have to be passed in when calling this function. And since I just have the one, I'll pass in append string there as well. One thing to finalize this call to OpenAI is to pass in the following, which is a functions call, and set it to auto. This will just allow ChatGPT to identify that functions are enabled as part of this request. It's time to call the request. Let me head over here within this function, and what I'm going to do is essentially set a value to identify if a function is needing to be called. What I'll do is set the value let wants to use function equal, and what I'm going to do is pull this out of chat.data.choices index 0 and check for the value finish_reason. Now this value in the start, I'm just going to console log this out. The main thing here is to check if ChatGPT is actually requesting to run a function. So to do this, I'm going to call this function. I'm going to call ChatGPT with functions, passing in it's about time, and I'm going to open up the console and run this. Using NodeJS, I'll pass in node./index.js. And here our console log comes out with function_call. This is the text within this value .finish_reason. So this finish reason, I can now check for this string, whether this string actually says function_call, and use this as a kind of boolean to run an if script. And this if script can then do the next step in our process, step 3, which is to identify if a function needs to be called. In this case, if it has this string, it will continue inside of this if script. And here we can essentially console log out the results from chat.data.choices index 0.message. And ideally, this has all the details for us to be able to run the function itself. Here they are. It says here that essentially a function call has been requested. The name of the function is for the hello world, and it has the arguments down here as well, which is for the append string. Now, let me head back into the code. I'm going to run an if script here, checking the message as well as the function call itself, and finding out the name for the function that's being called. What I want to do here is to make sure that it's the same function that I've defined. There's a few different ways to do this, but this is one of the ways that is a bit more strict, just to ensure it is the same thing. Now that I've got that defined, I'm going to pull out the arguments. I'm going to do this as an argument object. Here, I'm going to get the arguments from the function call.arguments, but because this is stringified, I need to run json.parse so that I can get this out as an object that I can use. Then I'm passing this to hello world. So hello world with my argument .append string being passed through, and here we can now call it. That's pretty much it. So I'm going to open up Node.js. I'm going to run the index file, and here, success, hello world with its about time. This is a pretty standard function. Right now, it's just a console.log. So how about I get this to return to ChatGPT as part of step 4? I'm going to make a few changes to the code. First, we'll need a return for the hello world function, because right now it's just a console log. I'm going to cut it out and create a new value here called hello. This will be the string, which will also have the append string value. Great, so I can now return this value hello, which means I can get rid of console.log. I'll be passing this into the next function here for call ChatGPT with functions. And this means that append string can essentially be pulled out as a value later on. Now I need to make another change. I'm going to remove the messages here and set it to have its own value. And this is so that I can append it later with the function call and its return. So here I'm just going to set it as its own little array. And since it's got the same value here, messages, it'll just be passed into the very first call to create a chat completion. I can now scroll down here to where we call the hello world function. I want to save the return of that value under content. And for this, I actually might define this before we call the if script. So it'll come up as an empty string. And here I'll add it to be set once we call that function. So here as a summary, we've got content, empty string. Content will be defined here from hello world when the hello world function gets called. And it should say hello world plus append string. Now that we've got this defined, we're ready to move on to the final part of this step. What I'm going to do is have our messages, which we've now set as an array, to push another value there, which is the value of our original response from ChatGPT. This is the one where the function is being requested to be called. But this is just as a bit of history. We'll need to push one more item in, which is the actual response from the function after it's been called as well. Here I'll create an object, and for this object I'm going to define this as the following. I'll set the role here to function, I'll set the name here to hello world being the function name, and I'll send the content to the content we received from that function. With all this defined, it always is useful to do a double check to make sure everything is correct, and I'll do this by setting console log and console logging out the messages that we have so far. Let me run this in Node.js to have a look at the output. Here in the terminal, I'll just run node index.js, and the response is essentially the history or the chat history that we have so far, which includes the system message, the user message, the call to perform a function, as well as the response that we have from the function once it's been called from our terminal. The very last part now is to pass this all back to ChatGPT, which means that we need to do one more call, passing all the messages across to a chat completion. I'm going to call this step 4 response, and I'm going to call await OpenAI create chat completion once more. Here, I'm going to use the same model as well as the messages, and really that's it. We don't need to pass any functions across this time. We want ChatGPT to look at the response of our function after it's been called and give some detail as to what it decided to essentially populate for the user now that it knows the response from that function. So I'm going to console log out of that response here called step4.data.choices.0, and let's call it now inside of the terminal. Looks like that worked. ChatGPT has said that the hello world function was called, and it had a string output which says it's about time, and it printed the following, which is hello world, it's about time. Let me show you the different steps that we took as part of doing this just before we jump into the next demo. So the first is we defined the function just up here. This was the hello world function, which then we were going to use inside of our call where we defined an interaction with ChatGPT. Let's call this the ChatGPT function. Here we did step 1. Step 1 was calling ChatGPT, but also defining the function inside of that call so that ChatGPT could use it. The next step, step 2, was to check whether ChatGPT wants to call a function or not. In the event that ChatGPT does want to call a function, then we move straight to step 3, which is actually getting all the arguments already and calling the function itself. And that brings us to step 4, the very last step, where we compile all the information, append it to the messages, and send it back to ChatGPT so that it can finally decide how it wants to handle the response of the function and its data. From a user point of view, they only really get to see step 1 and step 4, where they call a request and they get a response back from ChatGPT. Step 2 and 3 are sort of hidden in the background. Now, to be a bit more creative, I'm going to add another function here, and this time I want to be able to get the current time of day. This is something that ChatGPT just can't do, but here I'm going to create my own function called getTimeOfDay, and what it'll do is get the current date and time, pull out the hours, minutes, seconds, time of day, whether it's AM or PM. And then what I can do is compile all this into a return. This is what we'll be sending back to ChatGPT, which is this string over here, hours, minutes, seconds, time of day. But this is part of the function that will allow ChatGPT to now call the time of day and hopefully provide it to a user. Now let's test this out. Here in our message to ChatGPT, instead of just saying I'd like to run the hello world function, instead I'm going to ask it to tell me the time of day. So this is a simple chat log essentially, and for this chat log now we'll actually add in the additional function that ChatGPT can call under here. So this being an array, we'll just copy out hello world, and I'm going to remove the require statement because we're not passing any properties here, so I'll remove that too. I'll update the description of this function that it is getting the time of day, and I'll update the name here to be getTimeOfDay. This is just the first part of updating the functions available. We do still need to update what happens after ChatGPT requests to use this function. So I'll need to clean this bit of code up a little bit. I'm going to cut all this content for the actual hello world section and put it inside of the if script that we created, so it only gets called if it's a hello world function. But I can copy this if script now and I can make another one, and this one will be more specific for the time of day. So here I'm listening if ChatGPT is calling that function. I'm not passing any arguments, so I can remove that line. I can also remove this item here, which actually passes it to the hello world function, and replace this function with time of day. The rest of the content is more or less the same. I'll just update the message here to be called with a return of time of day. So now ChatGPT can call either hello world or the time of day. I can now run this function. Let me get rid of this passing statement and open up the console. I'll just run a node once more, calling index.js, and here we have, unfortunately, an error. Now the error is the fact that ChatGPT didn't give us the time, and there is a reason for that. The function was not actually called. And the reason for that as well is because I didn't label it properly. I called it time of day, but the actual function name should in fact be called getTimeOfDay. So make sure that you're specific with the names that you're using, because one mistake or one missed typo can cause the function not to work. Here, I still haven't updated this value here, getTimeOfDay, but now that I have, I can call it successfully, and ChatGPT now actually gives us the current time based on my own terminal. And this is the essence of adding multiple functions where ChatGPT can choose which one it wants to run and then give proper outputs to users. Now let's build a more complex example. I'm going to create a function which will do web scraping. This will be an advanced function and show you how you can create functions in other files and how you can call them through ChatGPT. My plan is quite simple. I want to collect up and scrape all the information from Goodreads for different types of books and then recommend certain ones using ChatGPT. Now to do this, I'm going to use Write Data. They're a place that allows you to connect to proxy networks as well as use datasets or scrape the web. The first thing I'll need is an account, and I already have one, so I'll log in. And then I'm going to select their scraping browser just over here. Luckily, there's already boilerplate ready for me to go, so I'm simply going to select the option here on the bottom right that says checkout code and integration examples. Now I'm running on NodeJS and I'm going to try and build an API. So the first thing I need is Puppeteer core. So in Node.js, I'll open up the terminal and run npm install puppeteer-core. It basically emulates a web browser and makes scraping a lot easier. Then there's this sample code here. This isn't specific to any website. I could go through it and try and rewrite it specifically for a website like Goodreads, but instead I'll select the lazy option of copying it into Chat GPT and getting Chat GPT to essentially write out that code for me. The simple prompt I'll use is that this is some sample code from Bright Data, and I need it to search up Goodreads for the keyword of programming for any books available. And what comes out is this piece of code, which is more or less the same, but just with more specific CSS selectors so that I can identify the information from that website accurately. Now let me copy this into VS Code and see if it actually works. I've pasted this into my scraper.js file, but I'm going to update the syntax here because instead of require statements, I'm using if. Then I need to run the main function. So let me actually do this by passing it here at the very bottom and executing it, and then opening up the terminal to see what comes out on the console. Now here, I'll run node scraper.js. This uses Puppeteer to create a browser. It connects up to the Goodreads website, searching through the results. Then it collects all the information from each one of the book titles and finally spits this out into the console. Looks like this example is working. So now I can take this example of a function and see if I can customize it to turn it into something that ChatGPT could use to communicate directly to the web and collect information and pass it back to users. Now let me prepare this scraping function to be actually used. First, I'll need a keyword which I can pass into it. So I'll define it here at the very top so that I can reference it throughout the rest of the code. I'm going to update the actual query for essentially checking Goodreads and looking up the keyword. Then I'll also update the console log so that I know what is being searched for. And the final thing I'll do is create a new attribute here, which I'm going to call return statement. This will loop through for each one of the books and add it as a string. And then I'm going to return this string here as a return statement. Now I'll export this function so I can use it in the main file. So I'll run export default main. Then heading back to the index.js file, I'm going to import it. I'll run import scraper from scraper.js, and now I should be able to use this within my code. But first I'll need to define ChatGPT to actually start using it. I'll update the message log here to say that I'm looking to get the top 5 books that come with the keyword ChatGPT. Next, I'll define the function. I'm just going to copy the hello world function I had earlier since it's more or less ready to go and I can reuse the syntax. I'll update the name of the function now to be called as a scraper, the description that it scrapes for books from a website called Goodreads, and finally the parameter, which will be the keyword, which is what it's searching for. With this done, I just have to update one last thing, which is the calling of the actual function. So here I'm going to once again copy the hello world function that I had earlier. Instead of looking for the function name of hello world, we'll look for the function name scraper. If ChatGPT Functions is trying to call this, I'll call it and I'll pass in the keyword, which will be probably the book name or the title. I'll update the message, and the only other thing that I need to do is this function here is a async function, so I'm going to await it since it does take a little bit of time for it to call the URL. And that's everything prepared. Let me open up the terminal and run this. I'll run node index.js. Here it looks like ChatGPT is actually trying to run the scraper. It's navigating to Goodreads, performing the search results, grabbing the book titles, and then presenting them back to ChatGPT, which now presents back a response to the user. And this looks all correct. I've only got 5 recommendations here, even though I know that the scraping basically provided a lot more. And these recommendations are the ones that ChatGPT decided. So this is essentially all working. It means that ChatGPT is now connected to the web, scraping information and then compiling that and giving it back to users. And you can imagine the business potential for something like this. You could get GPT functions to analyze different types of products and then compare them and their prices and delivery dates and send that information back to a user to best give them recommendations they might need. I'm going to upload all the code that I've done in this example here to my repository ChatGPT Functions. I'll link this in the description below, so if you want to replicate it or use it yourself, you should be able to do so easily. I'd also like to thank Bright Data for sponsoring this video. They make it and others possible on this channel, and if you want to check them out, they're actually kind of cool. They've got lots of other features, not just scraping information and proxy networks, but even data sets where you can pull out data from existing websites websites, and they integrate with lots and lots of different frameworks. And here you can see quite a few different creators have actually made content on them if you want to learn more about scraping as well as web proxies.